we should be live. We have a very interesting conversation today. I'm joined by the now quite famous John Aziz, who's been a Palestinian voice for coexistence and peace since October the 7th. And we're going to talk about a very, very controversial subject. And we're going to explore the morality of Trump's plan for Gaza, an Israeli and a Palestinian. And we're going to get into the reads. This is the video that will probably get me cancelled. It will get me deplatformed. So subscribe, follow, but you may not be following us for a long time. So without further ado, I'll allow John to briefly introduce himself while I make sure everything's working.
Hi, Joseph. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm John Aziz. I'm a British Palestinian peace advocate and analyst of Middle Eastern politics and history, among other things. I I'm Palestinian, so I oppose the Trump plan. I don't think it's actually a serious plan. I think it's mostly a negotiating position. I'd like to see what the real plan is rather than the negotiating position. I don't think that Palestinians should be displaced from Gaza. I didn't think that, the people shouting from the river to the sea who wanted to have a single Palestinian state, from the river to the sea, that was going to displace Israelis. I didn't support that either. I don't believe in displacing people. I think that the most realistic solution here has got to be one that's negotiated between two sides, and you have two sides living in peace together, and that's what I'm aiming for. So thank you for having me on the show.
It's my pleasure, and I believe everything is working. I managed to just do the thumbnails in time. So what I want to focus on to begin with is the moral implications of this. Let's assume that this isn't a negotiating tactic. Trump is dead serious on relocating almost 2 million people from Gaza. Let's also consider the polling that's coming out of Israel, where 80% of Israelis, at least according to one of the polls, would be in support of this. It leaves us in a very interesting and quite a unexpected space where, for the first time in decades, a democracy, a Western nation, so to speak, and certainly in the case of America as a Western nation, are entertaining the prospect of relocating a large number of people. And so what I'd like to maybe do to begin with is to first set the scene, and see what common ground both you and I have, John. So the first thing I'm going to float to you is actually, before we do all of that, should we play one of Trump's clips just to set the scene for those that
Let's
maybe
do it.
aren't aware of what we're talking, that have been living under a rock? We'll play one of Trump's just a short extract from one of the from the press conference. So let me just share a screen. So let me know if you can hear this again.
Being in his presence just has not been good, and it should not go through a process of rebuilding and occupation by the same people that have really stood there and fought for it and lived there and died there and lived a miserable existence there. Instead, we should go to other countries of interest with humanitarian hearts, and there are many of them that want to do this, and build various domains that will ultimately be occupied by the 1.8 million Palestinians living in Gaza, ending the death and destruction and, frankly, bad luck. This can be paid for by neighboring countries of great wealth. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 12. It could be numerous sites, or it could be one large site. But the people will be able to live in comfort and peace, and we'll make sure something really spectacular.
Okay, so that set the scene. So there's a huge population in Gaza. And a first question to you, John, what I'll throw it out there. For you, is that ethnic cleansing, what he's described there, if he is to follow through with that?
If it's a permanent ethnic cleansing, if it's a permanent movement and they can't come back, and then the people who are living there are replaced by another group of people, whether that's, it becomes American land and people from Florida can move there, or it becomes Israeli land, or Yeah, I think that is a plan for ethnic cleansing. I strongly would advocate against that. This land's been the home of Palestinians for many centuries, and or certainly people who call themselves Palestinians today, maybe they were Ottomans at one point, and the identities do sometimes shift, but very clearly, the Palestinian people are deeply, deeply rooted in this land, and I think it would be tremendously unfair and an act of ethnic cleansing to banish them and to replace them with another group of people. Yes.
So as the conversation develops, I would really like to drill into the whole concept of ethnic cleansing and the morality behind it, which is definitely going to be an interesting take. But first, I think let's find some common ground. So we both would look at Gaza today, I assume, and believe Trump's description of it as being a demolition site,
Yes.
as being a hellscape or hellhole,
Yes.
as he called it, is accurate. It's unlivable.
Absolutely.
Basic necessities like water, clean water, electricity, roads, healthcare, hospital, education, it's not going to be there for years. And the UN is saying it's going to take decades to rebuild, to the tune of $80 billion in cost. So this is the challenge. You've got 2 million people, almost 2 million people, living under these conditions. And so we'll pause the permanent versus temporary question for now, but look at the concept of transfer itself. And so you've got two types of transfer. So let's see if we can, again, find some common ground. So I would say a very uncontroversial take would be that if the people in Gaza voluntarily want to leave, which there have been numerous videos which I can find and play, and journalists that have gone in and asked the Gazans that are living there, not the ones that are tweeting around the clock and propaganda, but the people that are actually suffering and living in dire conditions, they're repeatedly saying that they want to leave. And one of the things that they're saying is they don't necessarily want to go to Egypt or Jordan, but they want to go to places where they can live, where they can breathe, places like Europe, places like Canada, places like Sweden, Britain, etc. Now, ignoring what those nations want and whether they'd welcome them in, if it's the will of the people that are living there to leave, be it permanently or temporarily, would you describe that as immoral?
I think that has to be handled on an individual basis. I think that individuals and their families certainly do have a right to leave. I don't think that it's something that should be emphasized or encouraged. I think that what should be emphasized and encouraged is that this is going to be part of the future Palestinian state, and that is what Gaza is ultimately. Yes, Hamas did horrific things, unspeakable things on October the 7th. Yes, Hamas has failed the Palestinian people. Yes, Hamas has no future as the government of Gaza. Nonetheless, Gaza should remain part of the Palestinian future. Do some Palestinians want to leave? Yes, no doubt. But let me ask you something. If Hamas was no longer the government, would these people still want to leave? Or if there was competent leadership, if there was a government of Palestinians that was about building up a shared future next to Israelis, and we turn Gaza into the Dubai of the Mediterranean, or the Singapore of the Mediterranean, or just Tel Aviv 2.0, Tel Aviv's sister city, the Arab version of Tel Aviv, the Palestinian version of Tel Aviv.
Palestinian gay capital of the Middle East.
So why not? Hamas wouldn't be very happy, but we should honor Queers for Palestine with a gay nightclub in Gaza. if that would make them feel any better. I think many Palestinians there would want to stay, and the vast overwhelming majority, including the people who want to leave now, I think almost certainly, if there was a possibility of a bright future in Gaza, they would probably want to stay. I mean, yeah, people don't want to live in a war zone. People don't want to live under a repressive government. Certainly people with more liberal inclinations, such as myself, I wouldn't want to live under Hamas. But I think Gaza potentially could just be a normal city, a normal Palestinian city, if it's not being ruled by a bunch of degenerate terrorists such as Hamas, right? Hamas is not a legitimate representation of the will of the Palestinian people. Hamas is more of a representation of the foreign policy aims of Iran and Qatar. So, no, I'm not against individuals wanting to leave. I think Palestinians should have a choice, right? I think that the question of whether European countries are willing to accept Palestinian refugees is another question entirely. I certainly wouldn't, in the current environment, I'm not going to put that on any European countries. So certainly there have been European countries who have claimed to have a friendly disposition towards Palestinians, whether that's Spain, whether that's Ireland, whether that's some of the Nordic countries. Sure, maybe they are happy for some Palestinians to temporarily or even permanently relocate there. That's up to them. But I would absolutely not be looking to put emphasis on Palestinians being encouraged to leave. I think that is a step towards kind of the Ben Gvir dream, the Daniela Weiss dream of Gaza becoming a part of Israel, right?
And so I think the idea of whether Gaza's become part of Israel or not, I think park that, and we can come back to that. But I think the key thing for me there is that you don't oppose the idea of Gazans wanting to leave of their own free will, and without making any, without that being an indicator that they're relinquishing any rights to that land, so to speak. So they can leave, but if the body of Gazans don't want to leave, they have every right to stay. One thing I would add is that I think the majority would leave not because of Hamas. I think the majority would leave. One of the quotes I heard in a video was to do with, let those that are telling us to leave live in the tents. They're literally living in tents with the most basic of telling us that we can't leave. Experience living in tents. We're living in tents. We're living in squalor. We don't have.
Yeah, it's awful.
Water. We just want to. Things that we take for granted, they don't have.
Yeah, it's awful. That's awful. But if it were Israelis living in tents, if the shoe was on the other foot, I don't think people would be talking about wanting Israelis to give up, or certainly you or people who I'm on decent terms with would not be talking about Israelis having to relinquish their rights if they wanted to go and live somewhere that was not living in tents. I think, I understand that the situation in Gaza is awful, and Palestinians in Gaza are in a desperate situation. That living in a tent is a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. And I think that temporary voluntary relocation to other places where people can live in a better situation, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But I do have much more of a problem with this sort of slippery slope towards Palestinians relinquishing control of Gaza.
So I've just been told in the chat they can't hear me, so I'm going to try and boost up my microphone. Bear with me.
You're a little bit quiet, yeah, I'd say.
Okay, let me boost up the. Bear with me. Apologies. If people could let me know in the chat. If
that's a little bit better.
Any louder.
That's well better.
Okay, I'll also make up a little bit. There we go. Hopefully now that's a little bit clearer. So now for the controversial bit, which when 80% of Israelis say they would be happy to see Gazans leave, I'd have to pull up the survey to get the exact framing of that question. Let's assume that is involuntary, and that's actually a forced relocation against the will of individuals. So what I first want to do is propose something which is the more controversial take I have on this, which is ethnic cleansing is a relatively recent term. It was coined around 30 years ago, following the breakup of Yugoslavia. Prior to that, there were population transfers, but it wasn't described as ethnic cleansing. It was actually seen as a moral solution to conflict in many instances. So the Ottomans practiced it. They called it sirgun. The British practiced it. Most nations and empires, or certainly empires, had some form of practice going all the way back to the Umar ibn al-Khattab of the Caliphate. he transferred the Jews of the Hijaz to Israel and to Iraq. And so this has always been something that nations have done. And up until recently, it was seen as a moral solution to ethnic conflict. So two parties were unable to live together, they would separate. So in 1923, around 1.6 million Turks and Greeks were transferred between the respective territories. In 1947, you had millions of Hindus and Muslims exchanged between India and what was then created from India, Pakistan. After World War II, millions and millions of ethnic Germans were removed from Eastern and Central European nations. And so this isn't a new thing. The term ethnic cleansing is new, but the actual concept of moving people to create regional stability has been around for a long time. So if it was seen as a moral solution, when did we depart from that? And this is where I kind of think I have a little bit of original idea. Be interested to get your thoughts on this, John, which is we are in a liberal society. And when we transition to liberal societies, that changed because a liberal society puts the individual's rights as they're paramount. They are at the forefront of our decision making on how a society should be structured. Whereas in more traditional societies, they would look at the majority, the collective, what is in the interests of the majority of people rather than the individual's rights. And so let's make a little scenario. Let's say you have a woman in Gaza who's lived there for 80 years. She was born in Gaza City. She's lived there her entire life. She doesn't pose a threat to anybody. She's not engaged in any war. She could be a massive peace activist. She could run an orphanage. And it would seem a huge injustice to force her against her will to leave. And that seems evil, at least to me, from my liberal perspective, where I'm saying it seems evil. But maybe it isn't. And I'm going to say, so how do we assess whether something is moral or immoral in this instance? So let's see if we can agree on what we're ultimately looking for. So from my perspective, there are three goals. I thought about this a little bit, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts, as this sounds the appropriate objectives for any solution we impose or that is imposed on the territory. So first objective is an end to the cycle of violence. That must be the number one.
Yes.
Second goal, the minimal harm inflicted on Arabs or Jews in that region.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
And then the third one, which seems absolutely crucial, is the maximal opportunity for those that are affected. So what I mean by that is that there must be material opportunity. So if we're in the instance of transfer, if you're moving people from Gaza to Europe, are the material conditions better? Is the education better? Are they better off in this scenario? And so they're the three things I think I would use to assess whether any of the solutions we're discussing are ethical or moral. So would you add anything into there?
I mean those are three extremely important considerations. I think a fourth one absolutely has to be that we respect the individual rights of the people involved. It's not just about material conditions. It's also about respecting their rights. And the Palestinians in Gaza absolutely have a long and strong, deeply rooted history in that part of the world.
So to that point, and I think it's a very important point, what happens if the rights of the individual are in conflict with the well-being of the majority?
I think that is a serious issue that democracies have to look at. You know, the European Union has, within its human rights framework, has ways of answering that, right? I suppose the U.S. Constitution also has a manner of answering that question. I think sometimes the rights of the individual do have to be minimized, right? But I think there's a degree of flexibility, and I think in this example, I believe that the issue in Gaza is not the Gazan people. I believe fundamentally the issue in Gaza is Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the militant groups that are representing the interests of the Iranian regime, and also the foreign policy of Qatar. I think that these if these groups no longer have control of Gaza, there won't be something that threatens the people of southern Israel. There won't be a situation that threatens the people of Gaza. I think for me, when I look at this, I look at the solution as being excising Hamas. I would be very, very careful to try to differentiate the people of Gaza from Hamas, and clearly there's some level of support, right? For and it's gone up and down, and at some point perhaps it was a majority for Hamas among the people of Gaza. Certainly, the current polling does not look favorable for Hamas in Gaza right now. I have a poll from Al-Rad which says that 74% of Gazans favor a two-state solution with side by side, right, and not Palestinians take all the land and kick the Jews out. So it's gone up and down, and certainly the relative defeat of Hamas in this war has had I think that's had a big impact on the perspective of people from Gaza. Of course, they're living in tents, so things suck for them. So there's definitely a willingness towards compromise. But I would be extremely careful towards anyone who's suggesting that the demographic makeup of Gaza today is some sort of thing that is stoking the conflict, or could be resolved by population transfer. I'm really not sure that it will. I would worry actually that imposing a population transfer solution over the heads of the people in Gaza could inflame things even more and worsen things for everyone.
Yeah. And so there's a few things, and I'm going to pull us back to the. I'd like us to run through a little thought exercise. But yes, I've seen the same polling, and Hamas had been losing support in Gaza for years. Prior to October 7th, it was because of economic reasons, and just that whenever you've had a party in government for a long time, the people begin to lose faith in that party. It tends to be the trend. And that had been in decline. October the 7th uprooted everyone. And I've seen the same polling, and you're absolutely correct. They do favor a two-state solution. But that was after the most humiliating defeat that the Palestinian has ever been inflicted on at least since 48, on the Arabs of that region, and certainly on the Palestinians. And their living conditions are appalling, and so understandably, there's huge opposition to Hamas. But I wouldn't mistake that for I wouldn't mistake. I look at Palestinian society, particularly in Gaza, as being radicalized for decades through institutions like UNRWA. They regularly poll as the most anti-Semitic people in the world. There are numerous militant factions, of which Hamas is just one, and a humiliating defeat, which has ruined the lives of the people that live there, shouldn't be mistaken for a long-term desire to coexist and live in peace. And I think I watched the videos of mobs like rushing out and spitting on the corpses of the hostages and the victims of October the 7th. I watch and I read Palestinian Twitter, Telegram, and there was jubilation. And what's followed that is regret, and understandable regret. But I don't think that necessarily should be translated to these two communities can live together long term in perfect harmony. But parking that, we can come back to that. What I'd then like to do is just look at what's actually on the table now. I actually don't think that Trump is talking about a forced and permanent transfer, because
he did use the word permanent. Just to be clear,
he used the word permanent to do with America's ownership. And we can go back to the video. Unless he maybe said it in another place where at the press conference, I mean, I've got a clip here which I can, where he actually gives what I think is a very telling answer. Let me just find the video.
Okay,
Which
let's go back to Trump.
We have to. So let's do. Let me just pop open the video. So, okay, this is the one. So I haven't watched this, but bear with me. Hopefully it works. Okay, so share. Apologies, people. If you'd like to pay for a moderator, follow all the links to donate, and we can pay someone to moderate these conversations. So there's no time wasting like we have at the moment. Okay, let's share this.
Would Palestinians have the right to return to Gaza if they left while the rebuilding was happening?
It would be my hope that we could do something really nice, really good, where they wouldn't want to return. Why would they want to return? The place has been hell. It's been one of the meanest, toughest places on earth. And right now, I've seen every picture from every angle, better than if I were there. And nobody can live there. You can't live there. So if we can.
So that's the first clip. I'm just going to now
play look at the look on Bibi's face. He's so happy.
Yeah, he is so happy. But let me now play the second clip just to really, and then I'll make my point of what I'm saying. So, sorry, apologies. There we go. If you're on YouTube, pause. Now, share screen. There we go.
And I think the entire world, representatives from all over the world, will be there, and they'll live there. Palestinians also, Palestinians.
So the two clips there which I played, and let me just come back. First was, why would the Palestinians want to live there if we've created better material conditions for them elsewhere? So there seems to be a degree of agency on the Palestinians. In the second clip, he said that when someone asked, will Palestinians live there? He was like, oh, who will live there? He was like, people of the world. Someone shouts, Palestinians. And he says, yes, Palestinians will live there as well. So in that instant, in those two clips, it seems to suggest that the Palestinians would have some degree of agency as to whether they can return or not. And I've not seen anywhere, and it could be I've not seen it. I'm not an expert on this by any stretch, but I've not seen anywhere him saying this. He said America will permanently own, but I haven't seen him anywhere say that the Palestinians will be permanently removed.
I mean, if Palestinians are still able to live there, then that's a completely different situation. I think in the first clip, he was certainly downplaying the idea of Palestinians living there. He was saying, why would they even want to live there, right? I think why would you say that if your intent was to retain the Palestinian population as they currently are today in numbers? I think at some point at least from my interpretation, he seemed to suggest that they will be permanently removed. I can start.
Yeah, if someone in the chat as well can pull up the clips, you've got pros and antis in the pro-Israeli and anti-Israelis in the comments. So if anyone can find the clip,
I think that if Palestinians are still able to live there, and it's an American plan to transform the economy of Gaza and to transform the security situation in Gaza and to prevent another conflict, that's a very different situation. And that's something that I would be much more open to, and I think is much more reasonable. I think Hamas rule in Gaza has to come to an end. Replacing it with American rule in Gaza, where the Palestinians stay and where there is, American governance of the Strip while it's being rebuilt and while things are being reconstructed. I think that's a totally different and far more plausible idea. I think we've had conversations in the past where we've discussed Arab states such as the UAE, such as Saudi Arabia, getting involved in order to help the reconstruction of Gaza and try to stabilize the situation so that Hamas are not in control and so that we don't get back into the same war of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad versus Israel. And that's something I'm in favor of. I'm certainly in favor of the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other countries, maybe including Jordan and Egypt, helping with the reconstruction of Gaza and helping with the security situation. Now, if it's America doing that instead, I don't think fundamentally that there's a difference. I think America could potentially be a good third party to stabilize things and to prevent the slide back into conflict, because what's happened in the past is we've had wars, then we have a ceasefire, Hamas regains control in Gaza, they rebuild their military infrastructure, they rebuild the tunnels, they stock up on rockets, and they get ready for the next war, because as we know, Hamas's long-term goal is to displace Israel through a military campaign, a conquest, whether that's firing rockets at Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, or whether that is an October the 7th style breakthrough across the border. We have to avoid that. I, as a Palestinian, I do not want my people to be fighting your people. We are deeply rooted in the land of Gaza. We love the land of Gaza. Gaza is a Palestinian land, but we cannot go back to a situation. We cannot go back to a situation where we're in a hot war against Israel, which is one of the most effectively armed countries in the world. We have Palestinian guerrilla forces fighting against the modern IDF, and that's going to be a disaster for the Palestinians. So I don't have a problem with America playing kind of a security role, a guardianship role, a reconstruction role. I think that's totally plausible. But what worries me is Trump's rhetoric. Now, yes, as I said at the outset of the conversation, there is an element of Trump kind of using this as a negotiating tactic. He says ridiculous things. He says things that are beyond the scope of discussion sometimes to shift the Overton window and to put pressure on the people he's negotiating with. Fine. Okay. But as you know, for Palestinians, I think it's incredibly unfair to even be suggesting that Gazans are leaving Gaza long term. I don't think they will. I think as unhappy as Gazan people are intense, at least half, if not 75%, just will refuse to leave. They won't accept relocation. I think many of them will stay intense until there is substantial reconstruction, just because of their connection to the land. I think on the other hand, yes, there has been a desire among some Gazans, maybe some younger Gazans, maybe more liberal Gazans. Maybe they do want to go to Europe, some of them. Maybe they do want to go to somewhere where they can have a more normal life. And fine. I don't want to prevent people from having freedom of movement. I think what Egypt did on the Rafah crossing, not allowing Gazans out unless they paid a huge bribe to Egypt, was a disgusting form of corruption and probably led to unnecessary civilian deaths. The people in Gaza, if civilians in Gaza during the war wanted to go into Egypt to be safe from the fighting, as individuals, I don't think they should have been stopped. I think they do have a freedom of choice to do that. And the reality is Egypt did let some of them out in exchange for thousands of dollars per person, which is just disgusting corruption.
And so what I'd like to do is now bring it back to Trump's actual words and his rhetoric. And I agree with a lot of what you said. It may well be a negotiating tactic, because if it isn't, there would have been subtle ways you could have got the Egyptians and the Jordanians on board without their people revolting. Now that he's come out so public and said, you need to take on 2 million, 1 million, however many Palestinians, the Jordanians and the Egyptian regimes have no choice but to push back, because if they don't, it risks the stability of their own kingdoms or their own countries. And so let's bring it back. Trump has said there will be, according to his plan, nearly 2 million Palestinians will be relocated from Gaza. So coming back to our original 4 points that we put together. So let's say that is a forced transfer out of the Strip, and that's going to be a challenge in itself, but we'll get to that.
They won't leave. They'll refuse.
So let's say that is the case. And that will build into the argument, that this little thought exercise we're now going to do. So the first criteria was, so the question is, the solution we're exploring is a non-permanent but forced removal of 2 million people from the Gaza Strip. Is that the moral solution? So going by those things, will it end the cycle of violence? Well, it depends on the conditions of how that's achieved. Because so let's say you do move, you are able to move out 2 million people. And when we get to the harm side of it, we'll explore whether that's feasible or not. Is that likely to end the cycle of violence? Potentially. If you disband UNRWA, if those people are moved out to safe places, not necessarily, let's say many go to Europe, many go to places where they're able to access a non-radical education and rebuild their lives there, get educated in universities and schools that aren't indoctrinating you to hate Jews and that you will liberate Jerusalem, which is the UNRWA curriculum. Just for context for anyone that's watching, UNRWA's definition of a refugee means that the only way a Palestinian, and 70% of Gazans are UNRWA or refugees, educated by UNRWA. I think it's 70%, certainly 70% of refugees, and I think they're all educated by UNRWA. So the only way they can stop being a refugee, because you mentioned that they had deep roots in Gaza, but they don't see themselves as having deep roots in Gaza. They see themselves as having deep roots in Jaffa, or deep roots in Haifa, or deep roots elsewhere.
Well, there's a mixture of people in Gaza, and some of them are native Gazans. Not everyone in Gaza is claiming to be a refugee. Yes, it is a large
majority,
proportion.
though. We'd agree it's the majority.
Yeah, it is the majority claim to be a refugee from 48.
And 70% of them are educated by UNRWA. I think that's right. Somebody fact check
something like that.
Comments, which would mean that 70% of them see themselves as refugees. And so they've been radicalized. So what I was saying, sorry, the only way to stop being a refugee is to return to Israel or to die. That's the only way a Palestinian refugee can stop being a refugee: death or return.
Or an agreed solution that's neither of those two.
But that's okay, that's fine. Some future solution, but that doesn't affect the definition of, they would still be classed potentially even then as a refugee by UNRWA, even in a two-state settlement, because you had a two-state settlement with Jordan, and they still remain refugees under UNRWA.
Yeah.
And so that's the only way to stop being a refugee. And so UNRWA has radicalized a generation into believing that they have a right to return to these places. It's the only way they will no longer be refugees. And they radicalize an entire generation. You have terrorists in the school books, etc. And so the point I'm making with all of this is, within that framework, there is no chance. You'll never end the cycle of violence. If 2 million people are relocated elsewhere, Jordan, etc., that could potentially break the cycle of violence.
I don't see that happening. And my main concern there is that the narrative will become, this is Nakba 2. This is not, even if it's America doing it, it's not going to be perceived as America doing it. It's going to be perceived as America doing it on behalf of Israel. And the perception will be, we were Nakba'd twice. We've been ethnically cleansed again. And all of the same narratives will be doubled and tripled down upon. And you will, whether or not UNRWA is disbanded, right? These narratives, yes, they are being taught in UNRWA schools, but where they actually come from is ideologues within Palestinian society. What I would be concerned about is that if there is a second removal, the narrative is going to become Nakba 2, and there's going to be resistance too. And yes, they might be in Jordan, right? Jordan contains a border with Israel, as does Egypt, right? So potentially you will have more Palestinian refugee groups, and certainly if they've been resettled from Gaza, then that is another form of being a refugee, and they will be continuing to have narratives that Israel has displaced us, and we need to resist against Israel, and we need to go back and get our homes back, whether that's Gaza, whether that's Tel Aviv, whether that's whatever they put. Potentially nothing would be as good for Hamas as another resettlement of Palestinians, because it will play right into their narrative. Israel has done this. Israel has injured us again. It's taken our land again. Ultimately what it will come back to, I can guarantee you this. I speak to these people from time to time. I grew up as a Palestinian speaking to these people. I can guarantee you, it will become the only way to stop this cycle of us being displaced by Israel is to destroy Zionism. we're already there to some extent with some people, right? So some Hamas supporters, certainly Hamas themselves, they perceive it as Israel displaced us. Zionism is like this fundamentally evil, cancerous thing. We have to destroy Zionism. That's their perspective. It will spread, and it will encompass more people. This idea that they will push that the problem is not something that can be resolved as an agreement between two separate peoples, the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. It will become Zionism as a cancer. We have to destroy Zionism, and this will spread throughout Palestinian society and throughout the Arab world to an even greater extent than today. And I'm concerned about that.
I think you made one incredibly strong point there, and it's and I'd like to bring it back to you as an individual, which I think is the counter to that. So you rightly identified that Egypt and Jordan are as far from Israel as Gaza. They have a border. So the problem doesn't go away in that sense. So 100% you have warring communities on each other's shore, or in each other's border. You, however, are a testament to what happens when a Palestinian is removed from the UNRWA education system, because you are sitting educated in Western institutions, better educated than me. I'm sure.
I don't know about
that. I'm very sure of that. You're humble and modest, but you're very accomplished. You're very most Palestinians are one of the best educated groups in the world.
Yes,
we're not dealing with idiots. We're dealing with a very literate, very
literate, very educated people.
And you are a testament of what happens when somebody from that culture of education and is removed from the grip of institutions like UNRWA or Hamas. Because what are you doing? You're on here advocating for peace. You're advocating for liberal values. You're advocating for the betterment of not just the Palestinians, but the Israelis as well. And I think that's what Trump is saying. He's saying, if you remove someone from the clutch, the grasp of UNRWA, from the grasp of Hamas, and you place them in somewhere where their material conditions are far better, then they will thrive. That's, I think, the pitch he's coming with. I don't think he's talking about the challenge there, though, is he keeps going back to Jordan and Egypt. And if it's Jordan and Egypt, I think you're bang on the money. It will be more radicalized than it is, because the trauma will be so much deeper, so much more severe, because it's not the trauma of your ancestors, it's your lived trauma, which is far more radicalizing and far more intense. And so I think that's a very strong point. I think one of the things that needs to be factored into any discussion is if there is a voluntary or forced resettlement of Palestinians, if you're just moving them 5 kilometers south of the border, nothing will change. In fact, it will become more extreme.
One of the things that I find quite interesting is last time I was on your show, it wasn't just me and you. We had Hamza Houidi. Yeah. Hamza Houidi is a Gazan. He grew up in Gaza. He spent 98% of his life in Gaza. He went through, I believe, a UNRWA school. And he's more liberal than very many Western Hamas supporters that I know, right? Including Palestinians. Palestinians who moved to the West and their parents still spoon-fed them the Hamas narrative of eternal resistance against Israel. Yet, I know people who have been through the UNRWA education system. I'm not defending the UNRWA education system. I'm not. But I know people who've been through it who've come out of it more liberal and more open to peace than people in the West. So I want to be clear that moving Palestinians to the West is not a cure-all for the kind of Hamas mentality. And just as the people in Gaza, even living under Hamas, are not necessarily going to be swayed into the Hamas mentality. A lot of this comes down to narratives, it comes down to values, and it comes down to individual priorities and individual, just your sort of individual outlook to the world.
I would say that Hamza is definitely he's an inspiration. I find him a phenomenal person, given his circumstance and his situation and the message that he pushes and the risk he takes from both communities. I mean, he's got opposition from all sides. He's a very courageous man, and I have tremendous respect for him, but he is an anomaly. That is not the standard Gaza, which is why he takes so much abuse.
And certainly there are lots of people in Gaza who are pro-Hamas. Again, I have polls saying that there is a strong support in Gaza now for the position I take and the position Hamza takes, which is a two-state solution. But perhaps more telling is all of the people in the West, many of whom I know, many of whom I grew up with, who are Palestinian, but they still support Hamas. Or if they don't support Hamas, they support some element of the Hamas narrative, right? So I just want to be very clear and careful that being in the West as a Palestinian does not mean you're going to turn into Hamza Hawidi or John Aziz. It means that potentially you may well still have pro-Hamas views. So again, my perspective is that this is about values and it's about ideology more than it is about location.
But I think your ideology is shaped by your location. I have the views that I have because I was raised in the West. You have the views that you have because you were raised in the West. But we are products of our environment, and there are people that are able to break the chains that constrain them within that society. But that is rare rather than common. And so to bring it back, so I think you've made very compelling arguments. The one thing I would say is, to try and bring it back to the conversation. So the question we're exploring is, if Trump or Israel or whomever, the Jordanians, whatever, were to forcefully remove, albeit on a temporary basis, the Gazans from Gaza, even if it was against the will of some individuals, while Gaza is being rebuilt, you would be you could not entertain that as a liberal that believes in the two-state solution. That's not something that you could get behind.
I think what I would view it as is, I think I would view it as a very serious danger. I would view it as a serious danger to inflame and exacerbate the conflict and to perpetuate the conflict. And obviously that's not what I want to look at. I want to look at the conflict in terms of how can we find reconciliation? How can we work towards the things that we discussed at the start, right? Ending the cycle of violence, ending the suffering of people on both sides of the border who have been affected by violence. And I would be concerned that the forcible removal is not only a violation of the rights of the people in Gaza to choose whether or not they are going to live in Gaza, right? And I believe the vast majority would choose to remain in Gaza. It is a serious danger to making things worse. That's why I mean, first, do no harm, right? That's what doctors are taught. The first thing you should do is not harm the patient, right? And I'm concerned that this is. We're about to inflict a harm that could potentially exacerbate it. Yes,
the medical analogy, by the way, is the worst one you could have gone for, because the no harm principle is true, but from a medical perspective, sometimes you need a cut. So when you plunge that knife into the patient, it's actually scalpel, and you're making a precise cut to operate on the. That's harm. You're harming that patient, but you're harming them to make them better. And in the instance that we're talking here, you'd be saying, Gaza is unlivable, it's a hellscape, and it's been radicalized. And if the population were removed from there while it's being rebuilt, with the assurance that they could return at a later date, and an emphasis was put on de-radicalization, so you're not talking just like the rebuilding of Gaza physically, but the rebuilding of Gazan society from a culture's the wrong word, but de-radicalizing and deprogramming much of that hatred, because prior to October the 7th, it was the most anti-Semitic place in the world, one of the most dangerous places in the world. It was a terror state, and Hamas did still have huge support, even though that support was in decline.
And those are the things that I would look at as the problems, by the way, right? The problems are the ideology and the kind of infrastructural setup of Hamas in Gaza.
But that's Hamas are children. They're 40 years old. I say that they're our age. They're not. Hamas, like before Hamas, it was the PLO. Before the PLO, it was the Black Hand. This opposition to a Jewish state didn't begin with Hamas, and it won't end with Hamas. If Hamas has ruined, that desire to remove Israel is still going to persist.
If you want to reconstruct Gaza, I think it needs to be about Gaza. I think removing the people of Gaza from Gaza is to me it seems very dangerous.
How do you support 2 million people there? That's my it's.
I think
what I'm saying is if you create nice conditions over here, a huge percentage of those would rather go to that than live in tents and drink unsafe water and not have sewage and not have education and not have all the things that you and I take for granted. A huge percentage would opt for those if the material conditions and what was offered, but the incentives were appropriate. And that's what the Gazans seem to be saying when you ask them.
I think if the question was phrased a bit differently, you might get more support from Gaza, right? If the question was phrased, if Trump has phrased it, we want to help the people of Gaza, we're going to construct them a city, a temporary city in, let's say, Egypt, where they can go to temporarily. They will all be allowed to return, definitely. I guarantee that 100%. This is not ethnic cleansing. We do not want to ultimately hand this land over to Itamar Ben-Gvir. If he'd said that, this is about helping the people of Gaza, I think you might have got a bit of a different response. Because yes, it is certainly true. There are some in Gaza who would be happy to temporarily leave, but it would still not be a huge number. Even if you phrase the question as this is about helping Gazans, and I guarantee you're all going to be allowed back, you still wouldn't get a huge number, because there is a tremendous fear in Palestinian society that the long-term goal here is not peace in two states. It is total Israeli control from the river to the sea, and Gaza is now going to become a real estate development for Jared Kushner and Daniela Weiss. And I think a lot of Palestinians are tremendously concerned that may be the case. I'm not accusing you of that, right? I think you're a sincere person, but a lot of Palestinians would accuse Donald Trump of that.
I tell you what, I think the general attitude from the Israelis that I speak to is there's no desire for Gaza. There's a desire not to live next to Hamas. I think that's the ultimate desire. And I think amongst most Israelis, there isn't much of a distinction between Hamas and the Gazans. That's my experience. And I think it's born out of some truth. I think Hamas are downstream of Gazan society rather than Gazan society being downstream of Hamas. They are a product of the Gazan. They are a product of the Gazans rather than the other way around. And there are no moderate factions, as far as I'm aware, of any size or any real size in Gaza. Whether you go to Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, the DFLP, all of the factions are violent and extremist.
I completely understand the Israeli desire to not want to live next to Hamas. I would say, as a Palestinian, I have the same desire to not want to live under Hamas or next to Hamas, because Hamas's ideology is not conducive to prosperity, economic development, a normal life, right? Being able to live your life in a normal way, in a way that would make modern people happy. Hamas is not conducive to that. Nor is the Islamic Republic in Iran, right? There's lots of kind of authoritarian regimes across the region that I wouldn't want to live under, and I completely understand Israelis' desire not to live next to those regimes. My contention is that it is about changing the regime more than it is about changing the people, and I understand the point that Hamas, to some extent, feeds off a level of radicalism that exists in Palestinian society. Before that, as you correctly say, before Hamas were the fighters, it was the PLO who were the fighters. Before it was the PLO, it was the Fedayeen. Before it was the Fedayeen, it was the Black Hand, for example, right? And Izzadin al-Qassam, which Hamas take their name from, their armed division's name from, the al-Qassam brigades. but I understand all that, and I am just seriously concerned that by associating too closely this association between Palestinians and Hamas, and then putting the responsibility on Palestinian society and saying that they need to be moved away from Israel as a group so that in longer term there can be peace. I am seriously concerned that this is going to radicalize a lot more people. It's going to lead to an upsurge in stronger and stronger sentiment against Israel, against Zionism, against any prospect for long-term peace. And I think that this could, in the end, be another step in the cycle of violence. Because, of course, if you talk about wanting to abolish a cycle of violence, and the people of Gaza refuse to leave, how are you going to get them to leave without violently removing them? It is another step of violence.
So I think to go back to those 4 points, and I'll fill them in, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're reading. I was really interested. I wanted to hear your take, a Palestinian who wants to live alongside Israelis.
Oh yeah,
but also is in huge opposition to groups like Islamic Jihad and Hamas.
Absolutely.
And so to come back to those 4 things, so I think you've laid out a very strong case for why you believe that if the Palestinians were forcefully, albeit temporarily, removed from Gaza against their will, that wouldn't end the cycle of violence, because you believe, certainly if it's on the border of Israel, in the sense of Jordan or Egypt, that ends nothing. That they've still got the warring parties right next to each other, and you believe that if it was further afield, even if it were practical, it would still radicalize. So if they were to 2 million people would say 200,000 to Germany, 200,000 to Britain, 200,000 to America, 200,000 to Canada, until you get through the 2 million. You believe that still wouldn't end the cycle of violence. That violence would still persist. We don't even have to argue those points. That's kind of your position seems to have been.
Yes.
This isn't an end to the cycle of violence.
Yes.
The next one was the harm. So the minimal harm to Arabs and Jews. Well, to move 2 million people, that's not, particularly if there's a faction of those that don't want to go. And those factions are probably the armed ones. So the tens of thousands of armed Hamas fighters and Islamic Jihad fighters. There will be thousands
of deaths if this plan's implemented.
I'm agreeing with you. I think it for me, it only works, a resettlement of people, if you can end the cycle of violence. Oh, I've just lost the light. End the cycle of violence if you can minimize the harm to both communities. And so then the third part was the material conditions. I think this is the one where you really do struggle. The material conditions will be better pretty much anywhere than Gaza for the next few years.
I agree.
And I think there's a strong argument, but I think it has to revolve around it being voluntary rather than forced from your framework.
Absolutely. If people want to live in a nice apartment building with modern plumbing and with a washing machine and with a refrigerator instead of a tent, there is not much prospect of that right now in Gaza. But it's a matter of choice. Some Palestinians will, yes, they'd be happy to live in an apartment block in Germany. Fine. The world, we should not stand in their way. That is their personal choice. Right, and that is their right as a human being. But for other Palestinians, who would prefer to live in a tent, at least temporarily, so they can remain in Gaza, that right must be respected.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to flip over my camera, but just quickly, the fourth one is obviously the right, which is, and so to bring it back to where we both are with this particular discussion, what I'd like to do is you to frame what you think what you would like to see happen. I'll then say where because I've been asking questions, but I haven't necessarily told you what I believe should happen. So I'll do the same for me. And then if you've got time, I know it's a Friday, you're probably getting ready to go out and hit the town. I'm getting ready to hit the synagogue. We'll take some questions from the chat, but I'll let you just, while I'm switching over my lights,
lighting setup.
Explain what your position is, what you would like to see happen next.
I think that I would like to see a progression towards a long-term peace settlement between Israelis and Palestinians. I think that in Gaza, the situation is absolutely dire. Yes, the majority of people are living in tents. The reconstruction of Gaza will take a long time. I will be very happy for America to get involved in the reconstruction of Gaza. I would be very happy for America to get involved in the security situation in Gaza, specifically in preventing there being another outbreak of war between Israelis and Palestinians. I think we do have a ceasefire right now. That is not a permanent ceasefire. I think we should emphasize that. That is a temporary ceasefire to facilitate the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails and in administrative detention. It's not, this is, again, to be clear, this is not even a permanent ceasefire. I think we need to take steps towards a permanent ceasefire. But I think maybe the most important step is the end of Hamas rule in Gaza. I don't think Hamas rule in Gaza is sustainable. I don't think Hamas rule in Gaza is beneficial to Palestinians. I don't think Hamas rule in Gaza is tenable for Israelis who live near the border. I think Hamas has failed the Palestinian people. I think Hamas has horrific and anti-Semitic intentions towards the Israeli people and the Jewish people in Israel. I think Hamas must go. I think that must be part of the long-term peace process and settlement towards a ceasefire agreement. I would absolutely emphasize that what we probably need is we need help from maybe the more modernistic Arab states, such as Saudi Arabia, such as the UAE. I'm absolutely willing to accept that. I think if the United States wants to help as well, I think that is incredibly constructive. But I would be very, very, very skeptical of any plan that could involuntarily impose conditions on Palestinians where they would have to leave Gaza. I think that could lead to a very serious radicalization in not only among Palestinians, but also among Arabs and also worldwide.
And I think it's a very reasonable position to take. I think where I am, and obviously I have no input in this other than these are my thoughts and a few people that listen to me on the internet. Maybe I influence those, but I look at Gaza today and think it's unlivable. You don't have access to the most basic of necessities. And I think there are a large percentage of the population not only would leave if they were incentivized, would leave if you just unlocked the door. If the border of Egypt was unlocked, I think you'd see a surge of people crossing into Egypt, irrespective of what material incentives could be offered to them. I also agree with you that I think the ceasefire is likely to be temporary. I think Hamas and Israel will resume fighting in the near future. And so you have a piece of land, which I think is around, is it 360 kilometers square?
Something like that.
It's
pretty much exactly that, I think.
A fraction of the size of London. And a large percentage, like from 20% to 80%, you'll get different numbers of the buildings have been destroyed. All of the infrastructure has been ruined. So if the violence kicks off again, you're going to have people in tents that are likely to be the ones that are worst impacted. You're going to have more humanitarian disasters. You're going to have more civilian casualties. And so from my perspective, I think the emphasis has to be on incentivizing as many Gazans to leave as possible, so that those that remain are easier. It's much easier to distinguish the fighter from the civilian with a smaller population. It's harder for Hamas to hide amongst civilians when those civilians are relocated and living somewhere safe. I think the practicality of doing that by force is almost doesn't. It's not worth entertaining the conversation, because if you use force, you're going to run into huge civilian casualties again. And if the objective from both of our perspective is to minimize civilian harm, is to both Jews and Arabs, you lose that goal. So I believe Trump's plan isn't as... I actually don't believe Trump has any intention to do this. I agree with you at the beginning. This is a negotiating tactic. But if it were serious, I believe the Palestinians would have to be properly incentivized so that they could leave and they could rebuild their lives and they could begin to be de-radicalized and given the same opportunities that you or I or anyone else sitting in the West or the Gulf states has, because at the moment they have no hope. They had no hope before, and they have even less hope now. And so that's I don't see it necessarily as immoral. I don't think Trump is talking about a permanent removal. I think it is because the place is uninhabitable, and to minimize the risk of further conflict, and certainly if conflict were to rise, to minimize it impacting civilians. I think he's putting forward or floating the idea that there could be a resettlement of those. And I don't think it would be fair to call that ethnic cleansing, in the sense, because ethnic cleansing is to do with removing a group of people based on their ethnicity from a territory. That's not what's being discussed here. I mean, at least that's not what I'm interpreting it as meaning. I think you have a different take on that.
Yes, I think my understanding, and again, I may have misunderstood this, and I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but my understanding is it would involve all Palestinians in Gaza, and it would be a permanent resettlement of all Palestinians in Gaza. Perhaps, again, if it's not that, that's a different situation. But I want to make clear that
state in the clip that Palestinians could live there.
I think that was the second clip where he was being pressured by a journalist, and whether that would include Gazans being able to return, we'd have to see what the specifics were. But I want to make clear that my position is against the resettlement of the involuntary resettlement of Palestinians from Gaza generally. I'm opposed to that. But we'll have to see what Trump's actual position is, because it hasn't. Part of the problem about what the conversation we're having right now is Trump was not the clearest in his statement. Right? It was very kind of off the cuff. He almost sort of to be kind of. He almost seemed to be making it up as he went along. To be quite honest, so I things will become clearer as we see more of what the plans are. But I think not only am I strongly opposed to anything that would displace Palestinians permanently from Gaza, I think Palestinians in Gaza are 10 times, 100 times more passionate about that than me, because it's not my home. I'm not from Gaza. My roots are in the West Bank. This is their home, and they don't want to be displaced. So their opposition will be far more passionate and fiery than even my opposition.
And I wouldn't argue with any of that. Okay, so if you've got time, we'll take some questions.
Absolutely.
Which is okay. So if people in the chat just want to fire questions, if you do a super chat, we'll definitely read it. If you don't, just make sure it's put in a question format. So I'm just going to go through and see if anyone is sending through any questions now. So bear with me. And if you see any questions as well, feel free to shout them out. 121 bit. If you're on Twitter, head over to YouTube to ask the question, just so it makes it easy for us to monitor. Okay, first question is, why do Palestinians say Israel is their home then? Well, what that person is referencing is, you said that they have deep roots in Gaza, and so I think that's what the person is referencing.
I think that if someone's ancestors were displaced from what is currently Israel today, I think that people do in Gaza do make a claim that is their roots, because that's where their ancestors were displaced from, and that's where their ancestors may have been living for tens, hundreds, maybe even in some cases thousands of years. So yes, people were displaced in 1948. That's absolutely true. They're living in Gaza now. Not everyone in Gaza today, as we are discussing, is a native Gazan. Some of them are. We should be very clear. There are people in Gaza who are not displaced in 1948. They were just living there before. Their ancestors were living there before 1948, and we should also consider them. They're not making any claim to refugee status. They're just a Gazan living in Gaza. Just as my ancestors are, they weren't displaced from 1948 Israel. They're just people from the West Bank, people from Samaria. So the Palestinian people are not homogeneous. The Palestinian people are made up of lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds with lots of different experiences. We're not one exactly homogeneous people. We're not all refugees. Some of us are, some of us aren't.
So we got one from Jeff. It's obvious what the plan is. It's obvious. They will move them out, and then in order to move back, they will need to be vetted to return. Do you agree?
That could be one of a number of things that's being suggested. Again, I think Trump's been quite opaque and quite confused about exactly what he wants to do. I think that is one plausible version of what could happen. I don't think that Palestinians in Gaza are going to accept being moved out to begin with. I think that vetting people who are coming into a country generally is a good idea. I think vetting refugees on whether or not they can return to somewhere where they've been is a bit more controversial. Especially, if, as I say, people have long and deep roots in Gaza. But at the same time, I would say anyone who's a member of Hamas or committed an atrocity on October the 7th, that's I think they have much bigger problems than whether or not they're going to be able to return to Gaza, right? I think so. If you were part of the October the 7th attack, I think Israel Israel have a priority on people like that.
So I got a question for you. I know I'm not in the chat, but I'm chatting to you. If it's not about retaining territory, but it's about people's right to that land because that's their ancestral claim, what would your opposition be? So let's go back to Jeff's question, where Jeff says that they'll be vetted. Well, 70% of the people living in Gaza, I think this number's right, so please fact check me in the comments, someone. 70% are educated by UNRWA, which means they are refugees, which means they don't have deep roots in Gaza. They potentially have deep roots, potentially have deep roots elsewhere, like Jaffa, wherever, Beersheba, wherever they fled from in 48, but they're not from Gaza. So is there anything to Jeff's comment there? So let's say you're a refugee, you don't have deep roots in Gaza. Do they have the same right to return if there was a displacement as the 30% who do have deep roots?
I think my long-term goal certainly is a state for the Palestinians, whether they are displaced from Gaza or whether they're displaced from Jaffa or Nazareth or somewhere in 1948 Israel. I think they should have a return to somewhere that can be called Palestinian, whether that's Gaza, whether that's whatever the future borders of the West Bank are. That's of the future Palestinian state. That's still to be decided. But I will say that I think Gaza is almost certainly going to be an integral part of the Palestinian state when that is able to happen.
And so I think it's fair to say then that for you it's as much about the national rights, the collective rights, rather than the individual rights, in the sense that you're saying you want there to be a Palestinian state, and you believe the members of the Palestinians, the people, have a right to live within those territories, and you see Gaza as integral to that. And that's it's not necessarily to do with deep roots in Gaza. It's to do with
both. Okay.
For some both, but for others not at all. Like for some, they've been there since 48. For most of them are new. Most of them are not deep roots in Gaza.
Yeah, most of them are Palestinian refugees. But to be clear, for the people whose ancestors were in Gaza before 1948, the situation is a little bit different. But for the people who were displaced from other parts of the British Mandate of Palestine, they are still stateless people, and they are still potentially part of the future Palestinian republic.
Okay, let me try and find some more questions. So we went to Jeff. Most Gazans right now claim to be refugees. Why can't they count the status elsewhere? We kind of covered that. But if their ancestors went to someone else's land, would they be colonizers? Okay, we don't have to answer that. So I'm just racing through all the questions.
I mean, I think one interesting idea that I have put forward multiple times in various venues since October the 7th is that if there could have potentially been an evacuation of civilians during the war from Gaza to another part of what would be the future Palestinian state, so potentially the West Bank. I much prefer the suggestion of moving them to the West Bank than I do the suggestion of moving them to Egypt or Jordan. I don't believe they feel as if they are Egyptians or Jordanians today. I think that Egypt and Jordan's claim of rule over the West Bank and Gaza is over. Those countries don't want anything to do with the West Bank and Gaza in terms of ruling it. I think that the potential of moving the civilians from Gaza and certainly potentially moving the refugees from Gaza to the West Bank is one that has been quite underexplored because again they would remain in what is the future Palestinian territories, and Gaza during this war between Israel and Hamas, that could play out, and eventually I imagine Hamas would lose, and then I suppose the Palestinian Authority would want control of Gaza again. Trump certainly doesn't seem to have any intent of giving the Palestinian Authority control of Gaza. I think if you wanted to look at the bigger picture, I think that the Palestinian Authority should be very concerned because this was land that was designated to the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo Accords, and that looks to no longer be the plan. It looks like the Oslo Accords are fading away, and the Palestinian Authority may be a relic of a system that is not going to exist anymore.
Yeah, I think from the poll you quoted before, I think the overwhelming majority of Gazans and West Bankian Palestinians reject the PA. There's no support for the PA. Okay, quickly going through some of the other questions. So we had a question from Shayna: is Gaza a refugee camp or their homeland? You can't be a refugee in your own homeland. At Israel Advocacy Movement, so that's a question for me, but I'm going to let John answer as well. So from my perspective, I agree, you can't be a refugee in your own homeland. I don't believe the Palestinian refugees are refugees. I believe the Gazans today that have left the war are refugees. They are fleeing a real war where there was a threat to their life. They fit every definition of a refugee. I believe the 70% whose ancestors fled in 48, if they themselves didn't flee, they're not refugees. I'll let John give his answer.
I think that it comes down to the question of, are you a refugee if you're internally displaced? I think that clearly the people in the refugee camps in Gaza, they were internally displaced in what was at that point the British mandated Palestine that then became Israel. So their ancestors were internally displaced. They for various reasons.
Internally displaced, you're describing Israel as Palestine.
I mean, here's the complicated thing is that.
And if you're internally displaced, I agree, you could be. But if your grandma was internally displaced, that doesn't mean you're.
It was the British Mandate of Palestine. So the whole thing was the British Mandate of Palestine. So we're talking about internal displacement within what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, parts of which under international law then became legally recognized as Israel. So it's a little bit complicated, and the boundaries have changed over the.
Okay, we can ignore all that though. They themselves didn't flee any war. The 70% of the overwhelming majority of people in Gaza are 50% are under 18. The overwhelming majority are younger than 76%. Like there's 0.0 whatever percent of them were alive in 48. So working on the assumption that the overwhelming
I agree.
Of Gaza.
I do agree with you that there is this complexity of people's ancestors were internally displaced rather than them themselves. So, but the international legal structures that have been set up to deal with this stuff, it is still considering them to be refugees. Whether that's a valid definition.
But it's only because they changed the definition of what a refugee is for the Palestinians alone.
Sure. Sure, but
Okay.
I think we need more clarity and we need a resolution. Obviously I don't want people to be permanently refugees. I don't think that that's a serious solution. I think it's almost malicious to make people permanent refugees in the name of we have to dismantle Israel, right? That's not only is that malicious to Israelis, it's also malicious to Palestinians. So I think that the I agree with a lot of the criticism of the way that the definitions are set up. I don't think they're a serious long-term solution for Palestinians or for Israelis. So I am not defending the kind of definitions or redefinitions that you're talking about. I think that they're a bit of a mess and not particularly helpful.
Okay, I've just found a way of showing the question. I'm such a boomer. Okay, so and I've just lost it. So the question is, and this one I can answer this one. How would you do, what would you be your stance if all the Palestinians do an ancestry test and find out that they are all on average 30 to 40% Jewish? So the Palestinians as a collective are one of the closest groups to the Jewish people, and genetically we are close. I'll give you some actual lived examples of that. There's the alleged grave of Samuel, just outside of Jerusalem. Underneath his grave is an old Palestinian village. It's in ruins, but above all of the doors is a Magen David, there's a Star of David. They were alleged to have been Jews that fled the Inquisition. Set up a village, set up a community just outside of Jerusalem, and at some point in history converted to Islam over the last 600 years, or 700 years. Another example would be one of the most famous bakeries in Tel Aviv is an Arab bakery in Yafo called Abu Lafia. Abu Lafia is a Jewish name. There are many, many stories of Palestine. In Hebron, there's all manner of stories that the Arabs of Hebron have Jewish ancestry, or at least some of the clans have Jewish ancestry. And there's all kinds of crazy stories about them approaching Ben Gurion and telling them that they wanted to convert back and come back to their people. And there's like crazy stories of Jewish roots of Palestinians, many Palestinians. I don't think anyone disputes that. The majority of Palestinians, I don't think, do descend from Jews, but there's certainly been enough intermarriage throughout the ages and conversions throughout the ages that they are genetically close to us. So I don't think we have to speculate about what I would do there. And I think my stance would be the same. If someone has Jewish ancestry and they're trying to chop my head off, I'm not that keen to live alongside them. If someone has Jewish ancestry and they want to live nicely and play in the playground with my family and break bread, then I'd love that. So yeah, it's the intentions rather than the genetics that matter.
Yeah, I completely agree when it comes to the question of ancestry. I mean, my perspective is that unfortunately there's been a conflict between two sets of cousins, right? We are very closely interrelated. A lot of Palestinians do have some level of Jewish ancestry. It may be 30, 40%. In some cases it may be more than that. In some cases it's probably less than that. I think that it is a terrible, terrible, awful, horrific tragedy that we're still fighting each other, because I think we are descended from the same place in many cases. I think that many of the ancestors of the Palestinians were Jewish people. So that's a terrible, terrible tragedy, and we have to work together to get to the situation that Joseph described, which is hopefully we can want to live in peace together rather than the situation where people are wanting to cut each other's heads off, because I think that is just completely unacceptable. It's just, to me the idea of wanting to go to war against my cousins is completely unacceptable. I think that we have to cover resolution. That's the logical conclusion. We're both people of the land. We're both interconnected somewhat by religion. So I think it's incredibly important that we have to come to a resolution. We have to live in peace together. That's kind of one of the things that I'm most passionate about in the world, is that we end this stupid, awful conflict and figure out a way to coexist.
So next question is I'm going to leave this for you, John, and we'll do 7 more minutes or 6 more minutes now and end the stream at 1:30 or an hour and 30. So why do Palestine? Oh, sorry. Why do Palestine blame Israel when it was Egypt that cut them off? So why do the Palestinians blame Israel when it was Egypt that cut them off? I'm assuming.
I think Palestinians do have legitimate grievances with both Egypt and Jordan, right? I think Egypt and Jordan have caused problems with Palestinians. That's not to say that there have been situations where Israelis have caused problems with Palestinians. I think we should blame people for the things that they do specifically. I think we should be more specific, right? And yeah, I think it was an Egyptian decision to close the border with Gaza after October the 7th to prevent the evacuation of civilians. We should criticize Egypt for their decisions. Just as when, if there's something that Israel does that we disagree with, we should criticize Israel. And just as we should be able to condemn our own leadership when it's our own leadership who have failed us, we should be willing to condemn and criticize everyone.
Aziz, ? You don't think they will leave? Why? There are no military operations and no need for trucks of food, and none would be sent. Lost the question. This is a terrible system. Maybe I'm just being a boomer. Would be sent no electricity or gas or housing or any debris. Why would they not leave?
I mean, why would they not leave? I think, just to be clear, I'm not talking about everyone. We shouldn't overgeneralize. But I think there are many, many Palestinians in Gaza who would not leave because they believe that the reason why people are wanting them to leave is so it can be turned into a real estate development with Jared Kushner and Donald Trump taking control of it and developing large quantities of beachside property, while the Palestinians who previously lived there are going to be permanently in Egypt and Jordan. So they wouldn't want to leave because they don't want the change of the land no longer being a Palestinian land, but instead becoming an American land.
Next question, I'll answer this one. Would all the countries that claim that Israel is committing a genocide have a legal obligation to grant asylum to Palestinians who want to leave as asylum seekers? No, they have no legal obligation to do that. It would be a pretty contradictory stance to take, but it would not be a legal obligation. Maybe it would in some nations, depending on the human rights framework.
It depends on the specific nation and their specific laws. But I think that if countries are suggesting that Palestinians are fleeing from ethnic cleansing, for example, there are many countries who the government would who are making that claim. Of course, they would be open to accepting Palestinian asylum seekers, absolutely. But I don't think there's a legal requirement in international law on that basis, as Joseph said.
Okay, so the next one. Pardon me if I've missed this, John. This person has to be British. But what do you think would be the best way to persuade Gazans a temporary move would be in their best interest?
I think
you think it is, by the way.
I think we should de-emphasize trying to convince people of moving. I think that there is a right to leave if they want to, but that has to be that. I think it's a little bit mucky and a little bit unpleasant to be emphasizing you need to leave because it's in your best interests. I think people are well informed enough to make up their own minds whether they wish to stay in Gaza or whether they would prefer to relocate somewhere else. And I strongly believe that the vast majority of Gazans don't have an interest in relocating somewhere else.
This is a pertinent point, but we don't have to answer it because I don't think we can. But where are 300,000 Palestinians Kuwait kicked out after the Gulf War? And I think it's pertinent because there wasn't this huge uproar. But I think it's for the reasons John's saying. People suspect this isn't about the interests of the Palestinians, but about not wanting the Arabs to be living on that patch of land. And I think that's a fair stance to take. I think that is a major distinction. But if this would be considered ethnic cleansing, then that's certainly ethnically cleansing from Kuwait.
Yeah, so the exodus from Kuwait some of the Palestinians who were expelled from Kuwait were Jordanian citizens. In fact, there are still tens of thousands of Palestinians living in Kuwait today. So it clearly wasn't a complete expulsion. Do you know, Joseph? I actually don't know specifically where they ended up. I think they were a bit scattered, weren't they? They went to different places.
I don't know, so I try not to comment when I don't know something.
That's I have to say I know of the expulsion from Kuwait, but of Palestinian refugees, I don't know specifically where they went. But the Palestinians are scattered across the Arab world and across the wider world. So that, you know, I from what I understand, I think they went to various different places.
Okay, a couple more questions. Just give as quick an answer as you can, John. I'll let you answer them though. Israel gave them a kind of state already in Gaza, and are you saying we just give them a reset after what they did on October the 7th?
It wasn't really a state, though, was it? Is the thing. I don't think a two-state solution has actually been tried. I think what happened in Gaza is Israel did a unilateral withdrawal that didn't work particularly well. And I think we see the results of that policy failure, at least partly, in the culmination of the last sort of 15 years since that withdrawal. I don't think it worked. I think what actually happened was there was a power vacuum, and the power vacuum was filled by effectively militias who were acting on the interests of the Iranian regime foreign policy as opposed to the interests of the Palestinian people.
Okay, I'm just going to try and find a few more questions. I'm just going to put this up because I disagree so much with this. The says, I don't think John thinks much. He just spouts nonsense. I actually think he thinks a great deal, and he just says things that you don't agree with. And I think it's very important to listen to those on the other side, particularly those on the other side that extend the hand of peace rather than raise the sword of jihad. And so I think it's in our interest not to insult those that are kind enough to come on a Zionist podcast and entertain the questions of the enemies of the Palestinians as they perceive it. And so, yeah, I think John thinks a great deal, and I'm very grateful.
I don't think that. I don't actually see Zionists as my enemies. I see Zionism kind of as the culmination of 1,500 years of Jewish history and exile. So I don't see Zionists as my enemies. I see Zionism as it was always going to happen because the Jewish roots in the land are so deep and so deeply rooted. Like Jews were saying next year in Jerusalem for thousands of years. So it was always going to happen in some way or at some level. What I want is to mitigate the impact of the conflict, because of course there has been a conflict. It's a tremendously sad outcome that two people who are effectively cousins are fighting each other. I don't like that. It makes me tremendously sad, and it makes me tremendously uncomfortable. Really, I think that if you read history and you understand history, you'll understand that, of course, these two groups of people have deep roots in the land, both of them, and we have to figure out a solution that is going to allow both to live in peace and dignity. Because the status quo is just absolutely not acceptable. So I really do appreciate you, Joseph, defending me from your chat. I think
just on that note, I just like to end on because we've come to the end of the stream. I've got like hundreds more questions, which I'm not going to get through. I don't think there's any super chats. So John is the smartest representative of Gaza. Oh, we've lost it already. John is the smartest representative of Gaza I've seen yet, probably. John, that's from Graham. John is being, where is it? There's another. John is being an honourable man from first impressions. That's from DK. David says, I appreciate John coming on. John, you have a lot of fans in the chat. I just wanted to make sure you know that.
I appreciate them. People defending me from that guy, because I think that was a little bit of an unfair comment. I would say personally that I think way too much. I can be a bit neurotic in my thoughts. This is how this is how you end up being an advocate for peace. Is you digest the news and you think about it relentlessly, ceaselessly, and without any sort of remission. So I think that sometimes thinking too much can be quite unpleasant, especially about unpleasant topics such as this, where you see people being blown to pieces, people being displaced, people losing 30 members of their family. For example, people being kidnapped, people being raped. It's a horrific thing to think about. It would make you neurotic, and that's why people like me think about this question. Think about how do we incentivize, how do we work on resolving the conflict, because it's a horrible conflict and it's a pointless conflict.
And so yeah, and I think that's it. What the subjects we've been discussing today are ugly. They're nobody's ideal solution. Voluntary resettlement, forced resettlement, permanently, temporarily, just using as a negotiation. The reality is Gaza, huge sections of it have been reduced to rubble. Thousands of people have lost loved ones on both sides. This was a war that Hamas invited upon their people that did not have to happen. And whatever happens next, it's going to be ugly. It's not going to be nice. It's going to be against the will of many people. And so I think it's very important that where we can find voices that are willing to engage and discuss a shared future, I think it's very important to amplify those voices, which is why I'm incredibly grateful for you joining the stream. If anybody, well, I know a lot of you have appreciated John. I think his biggest following is on Twitter. Where can they? Oh, sorry, X. Where can they find you on X? John, what's your handle?
My handle is Azizonomics with AZIZONOMICS. So you just type in John Aziz and you'll find me on X. I'm also on Substack. You can find my articles. I write quite regularly for Quillette. I've written for Newsweek. I've written for Foreign Policy. I've written for The Atlantic. I'm quite connected with a variety of publications, which is I'm quite lucky to have a platform to talk about my perspectives on the conflict. But predominantly, I am active on Twitter, formerly known as X, or X, formerly known as Twitter.
Excellent. All right, John, thank you so much. To everyone in the chat, Shabbat Shalom, Juma Mubarak. If you're not Muslim or Jewish, happy Friday. and yeah, have a great weekend all. If you
Shabbat Shalom, Joseph.
Thank you. If you'd like to support the work, you can do so via following israeladvocacy.net/donate. And you can follow us on all of our social medias. We're on all of them. All right. Be well all. Shabbat Shalom. Juma Mubarak.